Hi, and welcome to InfoSec Pros. I'm Kayne, Field CISO at Hyperproof, and I'm joined today by Ali Khan, Field CISO at ReversingLabs. Welcome to the show, Ali.
Hey, Kayne, thanks for having me.
That's fantastic. And because this is a live stream, if you've got a question for Ali or a question about ReversingLabs or about Hyperproof, please drop it in the comments on either LinkedIn or YouTube, and we'll take these as we go. So I want to start out by talking about your career journey. At ReversingLabs, you've really focused on enabling heads of cyber defense and CISOs with a threat-informed, defense-focused strategy. Can you tell me about a particular project or some initiative that you believe really enhanced internal threat intelligence analysis and the resulting impacts that it had on the organization?
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, thanks for having me on. And as my role has evolved, and as most CISOs roles have evolved in the industry, as we see, right? What we are finding out is that we have to step back and really look at beyond the tools and services that we offer in cybersecurity, right? So we're starting to cover more across the spectrum of the cyber threat industry, stepping back, what that really means, explaining to organizations why investigating malware attacks against their defenses and controls, looking at their malware behaviors, and stepping back and understanding how you can build what we call the internal threat intelligence defense, right? And most organizations, when they get attacked, right, we've seen do not look at the type of malware that attacked them, don't have the capabilities in-house. They might have an amalgamation of open source tools or sandboxes that they use to really detonate the malware, but are not able to get that level of enrichment and that level of deeper intelligence into understanding what actually happened during the attack. And then, as SOC operators are really overwhelmed, it's 24/7. Level one analysts passed on tickets to level two or level three. A lot of context is lost, and a new attack or a new alert, right, or alert fatigue, as we call it in the security operations industry, occurs. So that's why we need organizations like us at ReversingLabs, where we come in and where we make sure we work and partner with the security operations teams to make them understand the benefits of understanding all the different types of attacks that they possibly had gone through, right? And look at them at a deeper context and really look at all of the traffic that they saw alerts off of, and then step back and really evaluate that. So when we talk about particular projects, right, we worked with a partner recently that was a network defense, right, network really detection and response organization that focuses on the network side, and our organization worked on the file reputation side of the industry. We looked at the data on the network traffic as well as the file data, and then we looked at about 200 different set of alerts in that particular project where we saw that they were neglected or they were treated as false positives, and looked at the types of malware attacks that was used against the controls that were at this organization, a joint customer of ours for both organizations. And we actually realized that 80% of those were, or actually above 80% of those actual incidents were actual not false positives. They were actual malware that could have penetrated the controls. They actually got lucky in those incidents by nature, by design, by additional set of control. But had it passed an additional set of control, it could have proliferated into a production environment or a set of users, and it could have had a much larger impact. So looking at that internal intelligence is really where our organization historically pre-SolarWinds really thrived, right? And then after SolarWinds, we started to work with more software producers and software consumers and application security as a whole to kind of evolve into that space and help the same file reverse engineering algorithm that we do in recursive binary analysis to apply to the actual software side of the house. So,
I want to get to that. I want to get to software assurance and software security, supply chain stuff. But what you're describing right there, I've always thought of being a high level capability that a lot of organizations, unless you're being banged on by nation states, which I don't recommend, it is not a good time, or unless you're actually regulated or required to build an internal malware reverse engineering capability, most organizations just don't go there. I'm going to set fintech aside because they are their own little creature. Are you finding that that's expanding beyond that, where organizations are actually voluntarily adopting these controls of having that internal capability, even if they're using a solution like yours?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kate. So I think most organizations are struggling with understanding what is a software producer's responsibility. What are they actually responsible for when we talk about software assurance, right? Who's negligent?
Mhm.
Is it the software developer? Is it the organization? Is it the partner or the fourth party partner? Or is it the software consumer who procured and purchased the software, right? So we're starting to step back more. We're talking to cyber insurance companies. We're talking to even legal organizations and lawyers that advise CISOs, right, and CEIOs in their respective roles today to understand what is the legal ramifications of a software, excuse me, that I purchased as a large
Mhm.
organization. What is the legal ramification if this software was it crash tested, right? That analogy, or was the software itself had vulnerabilities and it had an impact on my organization or my customer, who is truly liable? So we see that debate taking place, right, at a national level. We see it taking place at a Fortune 500 CISOs community, right, and federal contractors. So there's a lot of pressure on the industry as a whole, right, to understand who is actually liable, right? And the reason why I said that before answering your question, right, is because that is the real contention, right? We're
Yeah.
actually seeing, or else anyone would just jump on and say, "Hey, I think what we could do is we could start to inspect large software packages and acknowledge that we can't just install another agent onto an endpoint because it's hard to inspect large files. Like Sunburst was a large package, right? So it's hard to inspect large files. Do antivirus engines today, can they handle that? Most of them won't, right? If it's less than 65 or 70 meg, right? And you install it on an endpoint, it's going to become heavy, cumbersome. The user experience goes down. So there's
You're
that
describing
still.
healthcare right now, every healthcare workstation ever, unfortunately. But I also think you brought up an interesting point there on liability. We saw something about that in the national cybersecurity strategy around the notion of liability, too. So it's definitely part of the national conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest opportunities we have as cybersecurity professionals, as tools implementers, right, as professional services contractors, with working with SOCs, working with third party risk, working with threat prevention teams, is that how do we step back and say, how do we make this a joint effort as a collective defense effort where we not only explain the risks that not that are not uh, capable within the current tools today and where the gaps are, but then how do we actually have a true maturity mapping to get there, right? I think most of the time, you just want to throw a band-aid in the solution while you're still producing software or still releasing software. Velocity of software releases we've seen over the last few years, especially when you talk to software developers or release managers, the velocity has gone down because of provenance, right? Provenance being software provenance. What is the source of this software? What is actually inside it? Who is the open source library owner? Was that owner of that open source library? When was the last commit that they did? Am I now liable for that commit, right? That complicated dependency ecosystem of software is, I think, something often mistaken or overlooked. Not just open source, then you look at commercial, even commercial
Mhm.
off the shelf software, right, has the same embedded malware risk, tampering risk, secrets that you can embed unintentionally, unknowingly by not segmenting to privilege access management tool. And the list goes on
And I
and
think
on and
this is
on.
actually going pretty well to a question that's in the chat. And so thank you, Eric, for sending in a question. If you have questions as well, please do drop these in the chat on LinkedIn or on YouTube. But I want to take the question from Eric, which was, I'm going to paraphrase here. What do you say is the weakest link in most organizations' supply chain security? And what strategies can you use to improve that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I know we kind of jumped right into the complicated stuff, right? Which is always good. Yeah, we feel like the biggest gap today is that software application security testing tools as a whole, right? As a whole
Mhm.
spectrum, when we think of DAS, SaaS, right? API scanning, all of the things that you do in the CI/CD pipeline for pre-release and post-release, there's the biggest gap is there's no final check today, right? Oh, lost one of my headphones. Hopefully you can hear me here.
Oh, we can hear you just fine. Yeah.
Okay, I'll grab it while I'm doing it. So the biggest
You got so
opportunity, I think,
excited and your headphone fell out. My
that's
goodness.
right. That's a first for everything, right? So um, so the biggest gap I think today is that you don't have an understanding of where you can do pre-deployment, right? Pre-release, post-build scanning, right? So what that means is that final last check. It's just like the car manufacturer analogy, right? If you have a car manufacturer today that creates a car and doesn't do a final crash test on the car and
Mhm.
gives it out
Mhm.
to thousands of people that might buy a Ford, a Tesla, or Toyota, right? They're losing that opportunity to actually validate everything that functions together in that car and crash test it. So the same problem in software exists today. We're not crash testing that final build that's compiled
Mhm.
and that chokehold that you have pre-release because you push it out to containers, to cloud infrastructure. You put it out to different infrastructures that have their own gaps, right? So you need to really take advantage today. I think what we don't do as an industry as a whole is that final artifact, that final MSI file, DLL, whatever it might be, to scan it and make sure it has every single thing that you assumed was there, right? And not just from a penetration perspective, from a true recursive binary analysis perspective. So there's no dependencies, no embedded secrets, all of the high risk items that could put, as we've seen in the industry, right? People at uh, uh, negligence risk, legal reputational risk, and all these discussions that are taking place in what we call secure software by design, right? So I think
Mhm.
that's the biggest gap, obviously, but
Okay.
there's
So how would you up level that ultimately to somebody who's a CISO or better yet to somebody who is not a software professional? Like how would you actually demonstrate that first of all that's a thing that exists in the world, that it actually is a business risk, and then how have you seen this effectively be communicated to business professionals who don't come from a, admittedly you just described something fairly weedy, that if you've come up with it from a technical perspective you go yeah totally get it, but if you've probably got an MBA, what you just said, help me connect the dots there.
Yeah, that's a great point. And and most of your customers, right, at Hyperproof, right, are familiar with compliance terminology, assurance terminology. Business professionals are comfortable with business risk, right? Analogies that are simple to consumer buying behavior. Like if I give them an example, like, hey, if you open your Uber or Lyft app and you're at an airport, imagine, the embedded malware scenarios that could be within that application, that mobile application, before you ask for a car ride. How would you know your software is not malware, right? So I think
Mhm.
that's the biggest question we have to ask ourselves, is that what is inside the software, who deployed it, how is it deployed, was there I think a final trust mark, right? What level of trust was put into this software, and how do we build trust back into software, right? I think that's what we have to think, that any, even third grader or CEO or non-technical CISO to a technical CISO, a non-technical assurance, software assurance professional to even a technical one. I think that's at a simplest level we can all ask ourselves, is that how do I know I could trust this software? Who built
Mhm.
trust in it? what was the trust built on, and then kind of reverse engineer backwards to that question. And as we're finding today, because of the rise of software supply chain attacks, right? When we look at the Move IT scenario with all the class action lawsuits, we look at the GitHub repos that have been exposed for secrets, Circle CI, right? Kaseya's, ransomware downstream attack, SolarWinds, right? And the list goes on and on and on, unfortunately. What we're realizing is that we build trust into software, but we never asked ourselves, like, how did we build that trust into software? Because
I like that message, though, because you are right. That message of trust does resonate. I think people can ask, like, and we're starting to see that in the larger supply chains for security mandates out of like NIST CSF 2.0 or the recent revisions in other frameworks. But it also goes to a question in the chat. And thank you again for dropping questions in the chat. Charmaine asks what we consider to be the long-term implications of a major supply chain breach for a company, and how they, I'm guessing how the company that's been breached, how they would recover and build trust.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so at the simplest level, what you want to think about is you want to talk to your internal, who is responsible for internal audit, right? Who is responsible internally, and do you even have a person full time, depending on the size of the organization, right? It might vary. Who is responsible for third party risk within your organization? Are they aware of the different types of controls and tools that are in place to guard against third party risk suppliers? What are some of the additional vetting that they've done? Who is actually responsible for threat prevention for third party risk, right? So that becomes a security operations question now, right? This is a way you could bridge the gap between third party risk management, which are typically like non cybersecurity professional, to the security operations center, right? That gap exists today. And then bring in not just application security, because I think application security is a very outdated term, right? Bringing application security into product security, right? When we talk about software product, which encompasses that end-to-end whole, bringing CI/CD, release managers, software producers together in a room, create a task force within your organization if it doesn't exist, just like a lot of people are creating task force or working groups for AI, right? And LLM, right? Generative AI. Do the same for software risk, right? Create a task force for software risk management. So it's broad spectrum, it's not technical focus, and just talk about, here's the list of softwares we create. Here's the list of softwares we buy and procure and deploy into our environments. Do we actually have a full handle on all the different gaps that exist today? And you'll be surprised to find out that there'll be many gaps where organizations internally are not even talking to each other. And we saw that in the financial services, where fraud centers weren't talking to cyber. And even though most fraud was actually cyber related, right? When we talk about Bitcoin or all the different threat research that goes in malware that's used in fraud. So that fusion center concept kind of resonated within the government, right? And downstream to large enterprises. I think first you want to create a task force, bring all the right stakeholders together, and then identify the gaps, and then go outwards, whether it's to your third party risk suppliers, right? And ask for a software bill of materials from every software producer that you buy software from, right? Or whether you talk to your internal development team. How are you working better to scan releases? How are you doing API scan, right? And then those questions will naturally come up, and then you'll give, you'll have a good understanding of your maturity in each of those processes.
And I like that you're actually bringing people together, and you're not assigning third-party risk just to the one person who sends over the 1,200 question SIG that nobody fills out correctly and nobody reads anyway. So you're actually building a partnership there, and an internal capability to have a conversation and build a process, not just have this be a one and done. I do like that. And that also kind of goes to my next question that I'd had in mind, because I saw that ReversingLabs did a thing with PwC recently. I have hired many a nice former employee of PwC over the course of my career, love them a lot. And I saw that Reversing Labs announced a strategic alliance between Reversing Labs and PwC. And I'm going to guess that's a positive step towards bolstering software supply chain security. But can you tell me about the primary goals of that alliance and how it's really poised to influence the cybersecurity landscape today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we worked in particular initially with the UK team, right, of PricewaterhouseCoopers. So really, as everyone knows, the big five or the big four, right, in the audit, assurance, right, tax industries have a lot of downstream advisory roles naturally, right, as a result of an internal audit. PwC, right, does they have all these findings. Now someone has to be assigned those and remediate those, right? For the next 3, 6, 12 months. Same thing with
Mhm.
ISACA auditors, right? Internally, whatever compliance framework, whether it's NIST, NYDFRS, right? FFIEC, or it's a maturity framework. The result of that, comes out with a finding. So we went to, right, PwC, the UK team initially, and we said, you're finding a lot of third party risk, right? We're a high tech, right, a solution that does that in an automated fashion. We do automated risk assessments. You do manual risk assessment. If we can feed that automated risk assessment for any organization of yours, right, that procures and purchases that you work with, that consume software, finds out that there's a commercial off the shelf library like Log4j, right, scenario, right, that is in a dependency of the upcoming hotfix or a release of the software. What impact does that have downstream, right? And then we can do that automated scanning, right, by scanning the file that's about to be released, right, post build pre-release stage, and scan it for any kind of tampering behavior. Was it tampered possibly by a malicious threat actor, right? Was there embedded secrets? And we can enable that audit in a much faster fashion, right? You can ask 185 questions, right, as you asked earlier, or you could
Mhm.
scan the final build of a large high value target, highly visible software, right, that's on our endpoints today, right, and then get
It's
that.
probably more accurate than the questionnaire, honestly.
Exactly, and that's what we're finding the assurance industry, the software assurance or assurance as a whole industry is
Mhm.
shifting more and more towards automation, right, and integration to the controls and downstream to the tools to the SOC that remediates it, right? And the faster we get to that, we can get all of our cyber professionals as well as assurance professionals focusing on the right things. For example, does this log4j dependency actually impact these endpoints that might have risk exposure, right? Or it's because you need just not a software bill of materials, you need a comprehensive set of ongoing cyclical SBOMs, software bill of materials, for each individual software that's deployed. And and that's where we want to go from a maturity level, right? When we think of a
Mhm.
CMMC level 5, level 1, level 1 today would be I do manual reviews of all software that I purchase. Level 5, in a state of nirvana, we all want to be. I do automated scanning of every binary that is released, and that is automatically sent through my GitHub to and updated to my release managers as well as to my SOC and a Fusion Center and my assurance internal auditors. So coming back to your PwC questions, so that way they can now get ready for the next audit, so they know the
Right.
findings and they know kind of threats and vulnerabilities you might be exposed to, and then we're all kind of doing that shifting left or cyclical ongoing, as we call it, agile software development. We're doing agile security.
And I think that really does speak to another question. You may have already answered in the chat, but I want you to maybe expand on it. If you, as a reminder, if you've got a question for LA, please drop it in the comments on either LinkedIn or YouTube, and we'll take these as we continue to go. And the question is, what practices should organizations adopt to ensure software insurance and mitigate the risk of unauthorized code in their products? I think you kind of mostly answered that, but do you want to add anything else in just for that question?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think first of all, you have tons of right when we talk about software, right? Unfortunately, there's tons of risk. So you're right. So I think the biggest thing you want to do is segment high, medium, low, right? Like any project manager or program manager, right? Or a professional in the assurance space, you want to look at, all right, the highest vulnerabilities and the highest risks, right? And the highest embedded malware scenarios, right? How am I tackling those today? Segment those out from versus the medium, right? Am I, analyzing, production build artifacts automatically and mapping them back to the kind of threats that are internal to my tools that I used, right? And then you get down to lower risks scenarios that can external third party developer that I hire for pushing code, right? Are they using MFA, like certain like penetration scenarios, right? That you want to obviously hopefully have really basic cyber hygiene for, but still should be part of your risk profile, right? So I think
Mhm.
segmenting from high, medium, priority, low, we find in any successful project we've done, we don't go to organizations and say scan every single one of your applications right today and then get a million indicators of compromise or indicators of assessments and now give the SOC like 5,000 tickets if they don't already have tickets. What we try to do is that it's like a startup mentality: prototype, right? Build a skateboard, build a bicycle, build a car, and then build, right, the plane. So here you want to do the same. You want to have a project scope that focuses on 1 to 3 applications that are highly visible.
Mhm.
Scan those applications, understand what are the high, medium, low impacts, right? When we talk about mitigations, what are the mitigations you could take? So you have immediate results that you can go back and then say, all right, here's the next set of 200 applications, right? That we're going to do based on what we learned, and then build a process that works for your specific organization. Because we have different types of, when we work with financial institutions, they have a completely different time and project management lifecycle
Mhm.
than when we
Mhm.
work with manufacturing, right? Our manufacturing clients are completely different. Right? It almost requires 2 different skill set, approach, project mindset. So really be honest and aware of your organization's culture of security and how they work with third party risk and how they work with release managers, developers, CI/CD pipeline, DevSecOps professional, and really get a reality. And that's why I said go back to that task force strategy,
Mhm.
build that
Mhm.
task force of people within crisis communications to third party risk, bring them together, understand the culture, understand how it's going to be done, and then start very small. Start with 1 or 2 applications, scan them, right? Like test them, right? And bring out all the threats and vulnerabilities you could be exposed to. And then go build a process based on your organization, right? And I think that's the most effective I've seen people get scale against this problem, right?
Okay, and I want to take that and move to the state of application security and API security today, because in 2023, if there's one thing we've seen, like software supply chains attacks have been identified as a major threat factor. So, how would you say Reversing Labs is really addressing the risks associated with software supply chain, and what other strategies are being employed to ensure the security of applications within that context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so at a high level, we have this philosophy internally, right? That every threat, every scenario possible is likely gonna be a risk exposure to you if you know your internal threats, right? And when I say internal threats, what are you actually being attacked with, right? And the type of
Mhm.
software, whether it's your industry, the type of software libraries. So really building that, like the Cyber Risk Institute, right? And that risk profile, right? So building the risk profile, right? Understanding what are the different software producers, processes you have in place. How do you consume software? How do you procure it? How do you architect for it on your infrastructure? And then what are the patch management operations? So getting to that people process technology, right? It's really what's your internal process? What are the different technologies you use internally? what are their, right? And then really building a good, true risk profile. And then obviously threat modeling scenarios against it would be a good
Hmm.
natural next step for building out a good solid game plan in terms of increasing maturity in your security and response team. So, so I think here, when we talk about strategies, that you want to employ, obviously, adversary emulation is a great strategy. We're definitely preach and teach that. Running exercises against your own team, so
Hmm.
who's responsible for what, who's actually going to do it. I find, I'm on the board of several startups, right, that do this for a living, and they constantly find that what we thought what was going to happen, and when we ran the exercise, right, there's a huge gap, of course, right, and it's just being kind of honest in how do you build that best threat informed defense, right, response
Hmm.
strategy, right? So we're really good at detecting file based malware behavior, right? That's what we've thrived. We do recursive binary analysis really well, which goes way beyond sandboxing, right? Because you're not just getting a short-term detonation, you're getting the full life cycle of that malware, how it's going to proliferate, ties it back to all the different tactics and techniques, at which point in time would they be deployed, what point in time would the adversary move laterally, and then how do we build defense in depth within each of the controls we have. So when we talk about level one to oversight, level two, right, controls team talking to the oversight team, and then to level three, the governance and assurance professional, that's a great way where you can build this industry together. And then specifically, right, to your question, that's where we thrive really well. We can bring auditors, internal auditors, oversight professionals, the executives, the technical controls based on true evidence, right? We provide that
Hmm.
evidence, what we call threat intelligence. I honestly call it threat evidence, right? Because you have true evidence of an attack, an incident. We can reverse engineer down how it actually happened, look at the attack progression, and then feed that in an automated fashion so everyone becomes aware of it, not just the community, but internally people. And then we then emulate the adversary again and make sure it doesn't happen, right, by building controls around that, right? So, and you learn a lot, right? You learn that maybe I don't need to deploy that particular Java based right application that I'm using, and that particular dependency is using, right, that getting to a specific response, right, you learn that I can possibly disable that for these three high value target machines, right,
Right.
at that point in time. So it's really good adversary emulation. I think that gives you that intel, and that lets you build really good controls, I think, to mitigate against.
So really validating your controls continuously and not just like
Yeah.
hoping for the best, or not. I've seen organizations that have failed to do tabletop organizations, and they get into live IR and they go, oh, this phone number's wrong, what do we do? I want to take a question from the audience though, and the question is, and again, if you've got questions, please do drop them in the chat. Really appreciate everyone sending in your questions today. The question kind of circles back to earlier about government. So, how do you see the role of government regulations impacting the improvement of cybersecurity practices within private sector supply chains?
Yeah, so I think that's again a great question, right? So what we're gonna see in the industry, and we're already seeing it through the executive order 14028 that talks about software bill of materials, in particular, any federal right contractor doing work with the government needs to provide right a comprehensive set of bill of materials that is actually inside the software. That's a very static approach. I'll be honest with you, that's just table stakes. That's just saying that I gotta have a door handle when I get into my car, right? We gotta get to right. It's very simple, right? I think what we want to get to, right, as an industry is how do we avoid negligence, right? How do we
Mhm.
avoid class action losses? How do we avoid massive scenarios where 17,000 organizations could be impacted because as a result of one individual organization, right? So we're all kind of responsible in this together to uplift that debate that I was talking about earlier in our conversation is that who is responsible? We can't just push that downstream, right? There has to be a really solid, good understanding from the government. I think, unfortunately, and when we put too much power in the hands of our government, they really don't know what to do with it. And they come back with really long, 500-page, requirements of how to do this, which means do everything. I don't think that's
Mhm.
really a smart approach, right? Because I think a smarter approach to this problem is that each organization, right, going out, understanding negligence, software risk, right, legal risk, reputational risk, financial risk, operational risk at an individual level, and then making sure that they're joining consortiums, right, communities, and talking about it at their respective ISACs, their respective consortiums, their respective cyber threat alliances, whether it's the tech sector, whatever sector you are, there's likely a threat sharing community, a consortium that goes to face the government. So I think if every industry, every does that collectively and goes back and gives real feedback, hey, we formed a committee internally. We looked at our software risks and we realized here's the top three threats. I think then we'll have a really good balance of what are the true risks out there and
Mhm.
measures of controls we need to put in place, as opposed to what the government will just throw out there in what they call secure software design. And we've gone through a lot of those already, right? We've gone through a lot of
Mhm.
those and mapped those out and helped our clients map it out to maturity frameworks, right? NIST frameworks, right? NYDRFS, CISO frameworks, right? And how do you prepare? And each of those layers, I'll be honest with you, they're still at a very bare minimum, vague in the regards as to saying what is secure software design, right? And that's unfortunately the problem. I
Mhm.
think we have to get more and more deeper, and that's been a lot of the good conversations that have been proliferating out of ESPA Rama, CISA, right, and a lot of the great efforts that are taking place because the sophistication of the attacks are really high and our response is very basic. I think so. We have to get really sophisticated in the language we put in place. For example, we have to say if lightweight agents, right, are deployed at majority of enterprise endpoints, not to decrease the amount of operational downtime and the impact it has on an end user's experience. Can we safely say we're able to do a risk acceptance to a risk tolerance at those
Mhm.
at
Mhm.
that level
Mhm.
without us installing or inspecting every large package, right, that goes into through that traffic, right? That's a very specific set of control we can put out there. Right now, we put very vague terms out there that cannot really mitigate, I think, the type of threats that we see. So,
So what about those organizations though that are still being asked to attest to or to demonstrate continuous compliance with any regulations for securing the software supply chain? How should they be communicating that outwards? And what have you seen for like evidence collection associated with making sure that they're doing what they say they're doing, that they're managing their risks, that they're operating their controls, and then communicating that to either a certification body or to a regulatory authority, or I guess after the fact to an insurer if that
right.
happens, if they have a bad day.
Unfortunately, yeah, you don't want to get crisis response or insurance or I
Not
have
a
to
good time.
send a notice out to all my customers, right, that their data is compromised. Yeah, definitely those are downstream scenarios you want to. Yeah, so I think it's a good question. And when we talk about evidence collection, right, I think there are great ways. You have great technologies, right? You have data lakes and data lake architectures that are really good that share information out of your SIM, that share information out of your threat intel platform, telemetry data out of the malware and kind of um, threat intel repositories that you scan. So we have really good information in cybersecurity. Most mature organizations, I think, have a really good process to collect, store, and then share that evidence. I've seen. What we don't have today is how do we share that at a supplier level? For example,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, I am, bank XYZ, or I am large, like a retail, right, organization, and I have, I have 500, retail location, and I have, relatively large SOC, right, and I can share everyone within my supplier network is likely a supplier of my competitor and everyone in that retail sector, right? So so that's a great opportunity of lowering cost, right? So I think there's been efforts I've seen in the industry, not so successful, that have tried to do like, all supplier risk management, right? We all have common risk suppliers, right? How do we make sure we all uh, review and scan them at a lower cost, right? Because I think if we lower the cost, that's how we up the game for everyone, right? So for example, if Hyperproof, ReversingLabs, Microsoft, SAP, right, CrowdStrike, and Palo Alto Networks, everyone ends up using the same Java library for a time. We all share a common friend, right?
Yep.
So that's a great way for all of us to say collectively, like, that's an individual organization or open source library owner, right? And those individuals have to be protected, guardrailed, so we can lower the risk on that, right? And we can do that per supplier, per industry, at least the top, it's the 80-20 rule. Like, if you get the top 20% suppliers, you'll likely impact 80% of the industry. I don't think you should try to tackle each individual. Try to tackle the largest, right, suppliers, but keep in mind that threat actors are super sophisticated. They're doing reconnaissance for months and months, and they're trying to look at like smaller individuals in the overall supply chain, unfortunately, to go after, right? Because they don't have the guardrails. So that's where I think we have to really do a really good job in this decade, especially cybersecurity. I think is not going to be just about AI, and detecting, data poisoning attacks, and that's going to be a thing for sure. But I think largely it's going to be about supply chain risk management in an automated, at scale, at a point in time, at real time. I mean, not at just at a point in time, right? Automating this real time automation of supply chain risk. I think that's where most organizations definitely want to head towards. And anyone who's able to provide and up that game, I think, is really going to significantly lower the risk, especially given how complex the geopolitical, right, complex supply chain really is.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And I think that kind of helps for those organizations that are at that level of maturity where they want to communicate outwards, like, here's how well we're doing it. But there's a question in the chat that kind of goes right to this, and it pivots the question. So my question was like, how are organizations going to, first of all, collect evidence that they're doing the thing they said they were going to do, and then share it with anybody? The question in the chat from Lori, and thank you for dropping your question in the chat. If everyone else has questions, we've still got some time on the live broadcast, so please do keep dropping them in the chat. The question is, how can organizations ensure that third-party vendors and suppliers adhere to the same cybersecurity standards that they maintain internally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about, right, this is where I think differential analysis really comes in, right? So it's the same analogy in releases, right? Is 1.4.1 release of your new Apple, right, iOS update, how do you know it's not tampered with 1.4.2, right? Even though it's just a hotfix, right? You might say the risk of that is lower. It's the same analogy in this question, right? I think the biggest thing when I think about when we talk about sophisticated attacks, especially, is differential analysis, right? Is how do you make sure that everything that you knew was good, and now just like a small piece of code, right? A few hundred lines of codes are changed out of a million lines of code. You're likely going to build trust in that. You're going to say, oh, that's just a hotfix. Let me click update, accept, let me not go through the same level of rigor, right, that I need to. because of the new release. So it's the same analogy for this question, right? How do we make sure that we put the right type of trust mark level 1, level 2, level 3, right? Just like when you have, I think the government announced something recently where they wanted to build a check mark for IoT devices, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I
And
remember that. Yeah.
right, yeah, right. It's a good analogy. It's like, how do I know this IoT device is not, the firmware isn't compromised, right, by a vendor. Same thing, like when we think of software provenance, software assurance, right? All of these set of parameters and reviews and controls that went into, and the effort that went into application security, right? For that new release, how do we make sure that we do really a diff, right, analysis in mathematics,
Mhm.
right? So we built all of the controls in the previous release. It's just the additional set of code, right, that you assume that needs to be really reviewed, but it's not, right? The integrity and the assurance of that, there could have been scenarios that could have occurred, but how do you do that at speed and scale? I think that's the same analogy we have to look at. That's what we love doing at our organization. We love doing differential analysis of new releases to new hot fixes, and finding where tampering or certificates could have been modified, right? And all these small scenarios that could lead to larger risk exposure. Same thing should take place in our industry, right? Where we need to build a consortium of suppliers that are really high value targets, right, and high risk, and put guardrails and put in really good controls. So when they do push out information, or when they do create additional set of innovation, right, into the industry,
Mhm.
we're not putting our entire risk exposure. We're able to do that due diligence on them at front, and we're now just doing a differential analysis or gap analysis, right? So I think I'm using very pure software analogies here, but it's the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
thing, right? You really want to make sure that everything in that software, the provenance, the code, the secrets, everything is scanned. So there's no real high value risk that you've introduced now as a result of just this new minor fix, right? Because a lot of people are like, that's why point in time assessments don't work, right? Because you're like, oh, our we're a 9 out of 10. We're good. This is low risk, and then a new, patch is released, and now it goes from 9 to 1, right? Because now there's a huge high risk vulnerability out there that is introduced into this. So it's the same analogy I think we deal with as an industry in third party risk. As soon as some kind of new high risk item is introduced, the metrics, the KPIs change, and we have to get really better as an industry to understand how does that modify and impact downstream organizations, and then stop that from happening, right? And there's a lot of good ideas I've seen people throw out there, and I don't want to listen today in the webinar, but
Well,
really
I
I
would
would say,
definitely want to get into one of them at least that
yeah.
seems to be gaining some traction there. And you mentioned it at the top of the show, and let's talk about SBOMs. For those of you who don't know the term, software bill of materials, SBOM. And I'd say that given SBOMs are becoming really central to how both the US and as well the EU governments are defining requirements for their software acquisition, how should CISOs really prioritize SBOMs in their cybersecurity strategies to align with those governmental directives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, software bill of materials, keep that in mind. The biggest thing I always say is that don't think of software bill of materials as a static Excel file that you're going to get with a list of dependencies, and here's the open source library, there's the commercial software, here's the list of licenses, right? And so really it's about product visibility. That's what they are, real-time product. Think of it as real-time product visibility. So we have to change. Unfortunately, the government, when it passed its regulation around SBOMs and everyone started using that terminology, the supply chain industry before software was already using bill of materials, right? This
Mhm.
term already existed, right? BOMs, BOMs, right, already existed. Software bill of materials became a much more highly visible thing for non-technical or non-software professionals, right? Because now it's third-party risk. So I think when we think about them, the most important thing CISOs have to think about is that how do I budget for understanding the software bill of materials? Because we find today a lot of organizations are still struggling to understand them. So having a trusted managed partner, having the right organization that can produce a comprehensive set of SBOM, a cyclical real-time SBOM, and not just a static. You don't want to just get a static snapshot, scan your software and say, hey, I got an SBOM, I hit the checklist, I'm done. That is not the perception. Unfortunately, we've created that perception through the executive order. That is not the perception. The reality is that it's just like a software development lifecycle, an SBOM is really a living organism. It's a cyclical thing that every patch, every hotfix, every major release, every minor release, you need to have a real-time visibility into your bill of materials for each application. I would highly recommend you start with only a few applications so you understand it. And two, make sure you have people in-house that understand them. So for CISOs, they have to budget or shift around resources that come from software, that come from infrastructure, right, side of the house, and goes into security. So I think those things are taking place that I've seen in the industry, but really making sure we don't assume it's static. We make sure it's dynamic, and it's kind of going to be a problem for many years. So CISOs need to strategize and budget for software risk management as a whole, right? And that's why that task force needs to be created by the CISO and make sure everyone is involved in the organization. And then assign, here's the 2 FTEs, or I'm going to get a managed service partner that's going to help me with this, who's going to build the SBOMs for me, right? And evaluate. And then you get into the implementation, but making sure you don't create that mindset, oh, I've scanned the bill of materials, I've gotten it. That's something I've seen a big problem with lower maturity organizations get that, and then they don't know what to do with it, right? So I think, really building that mature mindset day one for the bill of materials will give you a real-time visibility into risk.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on this one as well. I have a friend who's a CISO, and we just had an argument or discussion or debate, I'm not sure which, the other day, and he generally agrees with the idea of SBOMs and walks right up to the line of version numbers, where he's like, no, we're not going to do version numbers. Like, it's okay to put in the components, like it includes these 3 ingredients, but not the actual version numbers, because of the perception that gives an adversary, if they were to obtain access to the SBOM, fairly actionable intelligence if they're shipping something that has a known downstream component that doesn't have a fix. So your take on that? Should we be mandated or required, or as a good practice, should we include SBOMs with version numbers, or should we omit that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. See, that's the level of tactical detail we need to get to in the industry. That's a great. So again, there's no right now de facto, right, outside of frameworks, right, Salsa, Cyclone DX, right, and these are really frameworks, but right, there is no really good recommendation. So I would say, yeah, definitely redact that, right? So to answer your question in a nutshell, but yes, those are the types of now best practices, ideas, and findings and standards we need to have good debate around with CISA, with NTIA, right, SSDF, right, the executive order, all the organizations in both the private and public sector that are actually actively engaging in working groups, right, Cloud Security Alliance to write your local ISACA chapter, make sure we're able to build like a significant, a shared document, happy to share our findings that we've done at ReversingLabs as well, and share all the best practices of deploying SBOMs and what to do, what not to do. And you're right. And then share that out as an FAQ within those consortiums so everyone can easily access them, because you're right. Like it might save someone 3 months of implementing the right SBOM standard internally if we can share that in our sharing communities. So I think that's really key.
Yeah, if you've got something that you can maybe drop on your LinkedIn page, then we could probably link out to that as well in our show notes. But with that, we've kind of hit time. So Ali, I want to thank you for being on the show today. And if you're watching this, and if you know somebody who we should have on the show, or alternatively, if you're that person who should be on the show, drop a note in the comments or just DM me directly. And with that, Ali, I really want to thank you again for joining us, and thank our audience again for tuning in today. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.